The sun was a hammer over the town of Redemption, beating the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder. Everything shimmered and warped in the merciless heat of the high summer, the raw timber of the buildings seeming to sweat resin. It was a day for staying inside, for nursing a tepid beer in the shade of the saloon, for cursing the very sky. It was not a day for a man to walk down from the high peaks, but that is what he did. He was called Nash, though few in Redemption knew his name. To them he was simply the mountain man, a figure more myth than neighbor, a man who appeared twice a year for salt, flour, and steel traps before vanishing back into the stony silence of the jagged ranges that walled their valley. He was immense, a giant carved from oak and granite, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin shirt and a chest deep enough to hold a winter's storm. His hair and beard were a wild, sun-bleached mane, long and untamed, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied his size, his footsteps making no more sound on the warped boardwalk than a panther's tread. He pushed open the swinging doors of the Redemption saloon, and the noise within, a cacophony of rough laughter, clinking glasses, and a poorly tuned piano, faltered and died. Every eye turned to him. The air grew thick, heavy with the unasked question of his presence. He ignored the stairs, his gaze sweeping the room until it found the bartender. He placed a heavy leather pouch on the scarred bar. "Flour, salt, coffee," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. The bartender nodded, wary. As his goods were gathered, a hulking man with a florid face and the proprietary air of a man who owned most of what he saw stepped forward. This was Brant, a cattle baron whose cruelty was as vast as his land holdings. "Look what the mountain dragged in," Brant sneered, his men chuckling behind him. Nash ignored him, his focus on his supplies. When the bartender finished, Nash added one more thing, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a vulnerability so profound it was almost violent. "And I need a wife." Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Then it broke like a dam. A roar of laughter crashed through the saloon, a wave of mockery and disbelief. Men slapped their knees, tears of mirth streaming down their faces. Brant howled, pointing a thick finger at Nash. "A wife? You hear that, boys? The beast wants a bride. What woman would have you, you damn savage? You live in a cave and talk to squirrels." The jeering intensified, a cruel chorus of insults. "You gonna chain her to a rock? Does she have to know how to skin a bear?" But just as the humiliation reached its peak, a quiet voice cut through the din. It was not loud, but it had the clarity of a single perfect bell. "What home will you give her?" Every head turned. Standing near the back door, a basket of freshly laundered linens in her arms, was Leanne. She worked for Mr. Chin at the town laundry, a figure so often ignored she was practically invisible. She was small, delicate, dressed in a simple light blue prairie dress that seemed to make her glow against the saloon's grime. Her face was a mask of calm dignity, her dark eyes fixed on Nash. The laughter died, replaced by a stunned confusion. Brant, furious at the interruption, turned on her. "You stay out of this, you—" But the question hung in the air, unanswered. It was not a question of mockery. It was real. It demanded a real answer. It was a question about honor, about provision, about the heart of a man. Nash, who had weathered the storm of insults with an unshakable stillness, slowly turned his head. For the first time, he truly saw her. And in that moment, the entire world outside of her question and her steady gaze ceased to exist for him. The saloon remained frozen in a tableau of shock. Brant's insult died on his lips, the venom in his eyes shifting to pure, dumbfounded rage at being upstaged by a woman he considered less than the dust on his boots. Nash didn't answer her question with words. He couldn't. The words for what he felt, for the sprawling, lonely expanse of his life, did not exist in a language fit for a saloon. Instead, he simply held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgment passing between them. Then, with a deliberation that was more powerful than any shouted threat, he gathered his supplies, dropped a few extra coins on the bar, and walked out, the swinging doors whispering shut behind him. He did not look back. He did not need to. The image of the woman in the light blue dress was burned into his mind. The next day the heat was just as oppressive, but the air in Redemption was thick with something new. Gossip. The story of the mountain man and the Chinese laundry girl had spread like wildfire. Nash, however, was not a man for gossip. He was a man of action, however small. He found himself not on the trail back to his mountain, but standing across the street from Chen's laundry. He watched for an hour as Leanne moved back and forth, hanging white sheets that billowed in the hot breeze like captured clouds. He saw the strain in her shoulders as she hauled heavy buckets of water from the town well. That afternoon he returned. He didn't enter the laundry or call her name. He simply walked to the well, filled 2 large buckets to the brim, and set them down on the porch of the laundry. He was gone before she came out to see who had performed the task. The next morning he did it again. On the 3rd day, as he set the buckets down, the door opened. Leanne stood there, a steaming cup of tea held in both hands. She said nothing, simply offered it to him. He took it, his large, calloused hand dwarfing the delicate porcelain. The tea was fragrant, unlike any he had ever tasted. They stood in silence, the only sounds the buzzing of flies and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. "Thank you," he finally rumbled, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. She gave a small, graceful nod. "Water is heavy," she said, her voice soft, her English careful and melodic. "My arms are strong," he replied. It was the beginning of their language. It was a language of deeds, not words. He would appear each morning with water, and she would have tea waiting. Sometimes he brought things from the foothills, a handful of wild berries, a brace of rabbits, a spray of mountain wildflowers that had no business blooming in the valley's heat. She, in turn, would sometimes leave a small, perfectly folded napkin with a few rice cakes inside it for him. They were building something, brick by silent brick, gesture by quiet gesture. He was learning the rhythm of her life, and she was seeing the deep well of gentleness hidden beneath his wild exterior. The town watched and whispered, but for Nash and Leanne, the rest of the world was slowly fading away, leaving only the quiet space of understanding that grew between them. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. In a town like Redemption, any deviation from the norm was a stone tossed into a still pond, and the ripples were bound to reach the biggest fish. Brant had not forgotten his humiliation in the saloon. He saw Nash's daily pilgrimage to the laundry not as a courtship, but as a personal insult. He saw the growing respect in the eyes of some townsfolk and mistook it for a challenge to his authority. His resentment, left to fester, turned venomous. It began subtly. A group of his ranch hands, swaggering with liquor and arrogance, accidentally stumbled into a line of Leanne's freshly washed linens, sending the clean white sheets tumbling into the muddy street. They offered a slobbering, insincere apology, their eyes filled with malice. Leanne said nothing, her face a pale, still mask as she gathered the ruined laundry, her knuckles white. Nash heard about it from the blacksmith, a decent man named Gus, who saw the incident and disapproved. A dangerous stillness settled over Nash when he heard the tale, the kind of quiet that comes before a lightning strike. He said nothing, but the next morning, when he brought the water, he also brought a heavy timber beam and, in an hour of silent, furious work, erected a new, higher clothesline, well out of the reach of accidental stumblers. The gesture was not lost on Leanne, or on the town. Brant, enraged that his message had been so easily countered, escalated his campaign. He and two of his men cornered Mr. Chin, the elderly, frail owner of the laundry, on his way back from the general store. They didn't lay a hand on him, but their words were blows enough. They spoke of rent increases, of new town ordinances, of how easily a business could fail. Their threats hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "A man's got to know his place," Brant had said, staring pointedly at the laundry. "And so does a woman." When Leanne returned to the shop, she found Mr. Chin sitting in the dark, his hands trembling. The fear was a cold, palpable thing in the small room. That evening, when Nash arrived for his silent ritual with the water buckets, he found the door closed and barred. There was no tea waiting. A knot of ice formed in his gut. He stood on the porch for a long time, a silent, hulking guardian in the encroaching twilight. He did not knock. He did not call out. He simply waited, letting his presence be a shield against the darkness he knew was gathering. He was no longer just a man bringing water. He was a man who had chosen a side, and in redemption, choosing a side was an invitation to war. The following day dawned clear and hot, the sky a bleached-out canvas, but a storm of a different kind was brewing on the ground. Nash had spent the night not sleeping but watching. He sat on the bench across from the laundry, a motionless silhouette in the moonlight, his mind a torrent of cold fury. The quiet world he had started to build with Leanne had been invaded, and the protector in him, the part that had lain dormant for years in the solitary wilderness, was now fully awake. He saw Brant and his men ride into town around mid-morning. They moved with the swagger of bullies who owned the world, their laughter loud and grating. They dismounted in front of the saloon, but Brant's eyes immediately swept the street, landing on the laundry, then on Nash, who was now standing, a mountain of a man in the middle of the dusty road. A slow, cruel smile spread across Brant's face. This was what he wanted, a public confrontation, a chance to put the mountain man and the foreign woman back in their place. He strode toward Nash, his men fanning out behind him. The town seemed to hold its breath. Shopkeepers appeared in doorways. Faces peered from behind curtains. The blacksmith, Gus, laid down his hammer, the sudden silence from his smithy an ominous bell. "Well, look here," Brant boomed, stopping a few feet from Nash. "The beast is standing guard over his little pet. You think a new clothesline and some glowering is going to change things?" Nash didn't answer. His eyes, the color of slate, were fixed on Brant. He was a study in absolute stillness. "I told you to leave them be," Nash said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final warning. Brant laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's just, He used a vile word, a slur that was meant to strip Leanne of her humanity, to reduce her to nothing more than a commodity. Something inside Nash snapped, but he didn't lunge, he didn't roar. The change was more terrifying than that. His stillness became absolute, the focus in his eyes sharpening to a razor's edge. "Say that again," he whispered, and the whisper was more menacing than any shout. Brant, buoyed by his own arrogance and the presence of his men, took a step forward. "I said, she's a—" He never finished the sentence. Nash's hand moved, not in a punch, but in a blur of motion. He grabbed the front of Brant's expensive shirt, lifting the bigger man clear off his feet with one arm, his knuckles brushing Brant's chin. The cattle baron dangled in the air, his face a mask of shock and sudden fear, his boots kicking uselessly. "She has a name," Nash said, his voice a low, guttural growl that came from the very core of his being. "Her name is Leanne." He held him there for a 3 count, letting the entire town see their powerful baron reduced to a sputtering, helpless child. Then, with a grunt of contempt, he shoved Brant backward. The man stumbled and fell in a heap in the dust, his pride as broken as his posture. Nash stood over him, his chest heaving, a magnificent, terrifying figure of righteous anger. That evening, the air was still charged with the aftermath of the confrontation. The town was abuzz, but it was a quieter, more thoughtful buzz. They had seen Brant's power revealed as hollow bravado, and they had seen the mountain man's quiet strength explode into fearsome protection. Nash found Leanne by the small creek that ran behind the laundry, the place where she rinsed the most delicate fabrics. The moon was rising, a silver dollar in the indigo sky, and its light danced on the surface of the water, making it look like a river of scattered diamonds. She was sitting on a smooth, flat rock, her light blue dress a pale beacon in the twilight. She wasn't washing. She was just watching the water flow, her posture betraying an exhaustion that went deeper than bone. He approached slowly, his heavy boots silent on the soft earth. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. She knew he was there. She didn't turn, but her shoulders lost a fraction of their tension. "They will not harm you again," he said, the words a solemn vow. She finally turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face in the moonlight. He could see the faint traces of fear still lingering there, but also a profound, questioning curiosity. "Why you do this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For me?" He felt his throat tighten. The simple, direct question pierced him to the core. He had spent a lifetime building walls around his heart, a fortress of solitude. But with her, the walls felt like paper. He took a hesitant step closer, his shadow falling over her. "Yes," he admitted, the word rough and unfamiliar. He searched for a grander explanation, for the poetic words he felt but could not speak. None came. He could only offer the simple, unvarnished truth. "Because my heart, it has been a quiet place for a long time, a cold place. It is not cold when I am with you." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, understanding, something more. Emboldened, he took another step, kneeling in the damp grass beside her so they were at eye level. He reached out, his calloused, scarred fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching the back of her hand, which rested on the rock. It was the first time they had touched with intent, a deliberate connection that sent a jolt through him, a current of warmth that seemed to travel up his arm and straight to his chest. "In the saloon," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I asked for a wife. It was a fool's request, a lonely man's cry in the dark." He looked down at their hands, his so large and rough against her small, smooth one. "I did not know what I was asking for. I did not know I was asking for you, Leanne." He looked up, meeting her gaze, his own eyes shining with an unshed emotion. "I would build you a home, with my own hands, on my mountain. I would give you my name. I would give you my heart." The news of Nash's proposal to Leanne spread through Redemption not like a wildfire, but like a slow seeping flood, infiltrating every home and business. It was one thing for the mountain man to act as her protector. It was another thing entirely to make her his wife. The town, which had been momentarily united in its admiration for Nash's courage, was now divided. The women who gathered around the general store's pickle barrel whispered behind their hands. It was improper, unnatural. What kind of life could a woman like that have with a man like him? Brent, his public humiliation still a raw wound, saw his opportunity. He couldn't beat Nash with his fists, so he would try to poison him with words. He began a campaign of whispers and rumors, speaking to men in the saloon, to the town council, to anyone who would listen. "He's bringing a heathen into a good, God-fearing community," he'd say, his voice dripping with false piety. "What's next? Will the whole town be overrun? Think of the precedent." He played on their fears, their prejudices, their resistance to anything that was different. Even Mr. Chin, who loved Leanne like a daughter, was deeply worried. He took Nash aside one afternoon, his face a web of concern. "She is a good flower," he said, struggling to find the right English words. "But she is a flower from a different garden. Your mountain is a hard place. This town is a hard place. Are you sure you can protect her from the frost?" Nash met the old man's gaze. "I will be her sun and her shield," he answered, the simple poetry of his promise surprising even himself. The weight of the town's doubt was a heavy burden. Nash felt it in the averted eyes, the sudden silences when he entered the general store. It was a different kind of fight, one he couldn't win by lifting a man off the ground. This was a battle for hearts and minds, and he was a man of few words. If you've ever felt like you were fighting a battle for your own happiness, and you appreciate stories where love and honor win the day, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support is the encouragement that allows us to keep telling these stories. Thank you for being part of our community. The pressure began to wear on Leanne, too. She faced the cold shoulders and the suspicious stares with her usual quiet dignity, but Nash could see the toll it was taking. The light in her eyes seemed to dim just a little. He knew he had to do more than just declare his intentions. He had to prove to the entire town that their union was not a threat, but a blessing. He just didn't know how. The world, it seemed, was determined to keep their two worlds apart. The answer came not from a man, but from the sky. The summer had been long, hot, and dangerously dry. The grasslands surrounding Redemption were cured to a brittle, golden tinder, and the forest and the foothills were a catastrophe waiting to happen. It started with a plume of smoke on the western ridge, thin and almost insignificant. Most townsfolk dismissed it as a prospector's campfire, but Nash knew better. He had lived his life reading the signs of the mountains, the language of the wind and sky. He tasted the air, smelled the particular acrid tang of burning pine, and saw the way the smoke was beginning to churn and darken. "It's moving fast," he said to Gus, the blacksmith, who was squinting at the horizon. "The wind is behind it. It'll be here by nightfall." Panic was a slow-acting poison, but once it took hold, it was deadly. As the smoke cloud grew into a monstrous, churning beast that blotted out the afternoon sun, a frantic, disorganized chaos seized Redemption. Men ran for buckets, only to find the well already overwhelmed. Others tried to hitch horses to flee, creating a tangled mess in the street. Brant was shouting orders, but only to his own men, directing them to save his prize cattle on the north pasture, abandoning the town itself to its fate. In the midst of this pandemonium, Nash became a center of calm, powerful gravity. His voice, a low roar that cut through the noise, commanded attention. "Gus, get every man you can. We need fire breaks, now. Wet blankets and shovels. To the creek bed south of town." He didn't wait for a response, but began organizing, his mountain knowledge turning into a battle plan. He knew where the fire would run, where it would jump, where they could make a stand. Men who had been running in circles now found purpose, following the giant who seemed to know the fire's mind. But it was not his fight alone. As Nash organized the men, Leanne moved through the town with a quiet, fierce efficiency of her own. She gathered the women, not to panic or weep, but to work. "Water," she commanded, her voice clear and strong. "Bring all water to the laundry. Wet every sheet, every blanket. For the men. And bring herbs for burns, for smoke." She turned Mr. Chen's laundry into a field hospital and a supply depot. She showed the other women how to soak cloths in a mixture of herbs that would help with breathing the thick smoke. While the men fought the flames with brute force, Leanne and the women fought the fire's effects with wisdom and care. As night fell, the world turned into a terrifying, beautiful hell. The fire roared, a living monster of orange and red, devouring everything in its path. Silhouetted against the flames, the townsfolk saw Nash, a soot-covered giant, working tirelessly, his great axe felling trees to create a desperate break. and they saw the steady procession of women, led by Leanne, bringing life-giving water and courage to the front line. They were not a mountain man and a Chinese girl. They were a team. They were the heart and soul of Redemption's defense. The fight lasted through the night, a desperate, exhausting battle against a relentless enemy. By dawn, the worst was over. The fire had been turned at the creek bed, a blackened, smoldering scar on the land, marking the line where the town of Redemption had made its stand. The air was still thick with smoke, and the rising sun was a dim, red ball in the hazy sky. The people of Redemption were utterly spent, their faces black with soot, their bodies aching. But they were alive, and their town was saved. They gathered in the street, not in chaos, but in a quiet, weary solidarity. They looked at each other with new eyes. Then they looked at Nash and Leanne. He was leaning on his axe handle, his buckskin shirt scorched, his face a mask of grime, but his eyes were clear. She stood beside him, her light blue dress stained and dirty, her hands raw, but her posture was as straight and dignified as ever. They stood together, a matched pair, an unspoken testament to the night's victory. The town sheriff, a practical man named Hank who had fought alongside Nash, was the first to break the silence. He walked over, his boots scuffing in the ash, and clapped a heavy hand on Nash's shoulder. The sound was like a thunderclap in the quiet. "The town of Redemption owes you its life, Nash," Hank said, his voice rough with exhaustion and genuine gratitude. He then turned to Leanne, removed his hat, and gave her a deep, respectful nod. "And you, ma'am, we wouldn't have made it without you." It was a seismic shift. The word ma'am, spoken with such open respect from the town's highest authority, was more powerful than any legal decree. It was acceptance. One by one, others came forward. Gus, the blacksmith, his face grim but his eyes shining. The baker's wife, who offered Leanne a warm loaf of bread, her first batch from a still-hot oven. Then a figure emerged from the small crowd. It was Mr. Chin. He walked slowly, his old body frail, but his eyes were filled with a fierce pride. He walked straight to Leanne, looked at her for a long moment, and then gently took her hand. He turned to Nash, and without a word, placed Leanne's hand into Nash's massive one. He looked at the joined hands, then up at the faces of the assembled townsfolk. He spoke first in his own tongue, a short melodic phrase that sounded like a blessing. Then he looked directly at Sheriff Hank and the others, and spoke in clear, deliberate English. "He has a good heart," Mr. Chin declared, his voice ringing with authority. "A strong heart. He will build a strong home." In that moment, Brant, who had been conspicuously absent during the fire, was forgotten. The community had found its new center, not in wealth or power, but in the courage and quiet strength of the two people they had once shunned. They chose not to be married in the small, stuffy church, but on a green hill overlooking the town, just beyond the fire's scar. It was a place of new beginnings. The entire town of Redemption came, not as gawking spectators, but as willing witnesses, as family. The sky, washed clean by a brief shower the night before, was a brilliant, cloudless blue. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth and distant pine, a promise of renewal. Nash stood waiting, a man transformed. He had scrubbed the soot from his skin and trimmed his beard. His long, wild hair was washed and tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore a new shirt of clean, soft buckskin, and for the first time he did not look like a wild thing of the mountains, but like a prince from some ancient, forgotten legend. When Leanne appeared, a collective breath was taken. She walked up the hill on Mr. Chin's arm, wearing the same light blue prairie dress she had worn in the saloon. It was mended and spotless, a symbol of her resilience. A few wildflowers were woven into her dark, shining hair. She did not look small or delicate now. She radiated a quiet power that captivated everyone. Sheriff Hank, looking slightly uncomfortable but deeply honored in his Sunday suit, acted as the officiant. He read from a small, worn book, his voice steady. "We are gathered here today," he began, "to join this man Nash and this woman Leanne in matrimony, a union forged not just in affection, but in courage and in fire." He looked at Nash. "Do you, Nash, take this woman to be your wife, to build a home with her, to honor and protect her, for as long as you both shall live?" Nash turned to Leanne. His stormy eyes were soft, filled with a depth of emotion that needed no words. "I do," he said, his voice a clear, strong rumble. "I give you my home. I give you my name. I give you my heart." The sheriff then turned to Leanne. "And do you, Leanne, take this man to be your husband, to build a home with him, to honor and cherish him for as long as you both shall live?" Leanne looked up at the giant of a man before her, her own eyes shining. Her English, once hesitant, was now clear and confident, imbued with the strength she had found in herself, and with him. "I do," she said, her voice like music. "I give you peace. I give you tomorrow. We will make a home. Together." With that, Nash gently took her hands in his. He did not have a ring forged of gold, but he slipped a simple, woven band of sweetgrass onto her finger, a symbol of the mountains, of their new life. The sheriff pronounced them man and wife, and as Nash leaned down to gently kiss his bride, the people of Redemption didn't just clap, they cheered. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, a celebration not just of a wedding, but of their own redemption. The days that followed the wedding were a blur of quiet joy and shared labor. The town, in an outpouring of gratitude, had helped Nash load his supplies. There was no mockery now, only helping hands and sincere wishes for happiness. Gus the blacksmith had forged a new, perfectly balanced axe head for him. The baker's wife had packed enough dried fruit and preserves to last a winter. They were no longer outsiders. They were a part of the town's heart. Their departure was not an escape, but a beginning. They rode 2 sturdy horses, not away from Redemption, but up towards the high country that loomed above it, a majestic wall of granite and pine. Their homestead was not a cave, as Brant had so cruelly suggested, but a solid, well-built cabin nestled in a small, verdant meadow by a gurgling creek, a place Nash had built with his own hands years ago, never knowing who it was for. As they reached the last rise before the trail dipped into the deep woods, Nash pulled his horse to a stop. Leanne stopped beside him. Below them, the town of Redemption lay nestled in its valley, smoke curling peacefully from the chimneys of the homes they had saved. It looked smaller from up here, more fragile, but also more beautiful. The setting sun was turning the western sky into a masterpiece of orange, pink, and gold, and the light fell upon the valley like a benediction. Nash looked not at the town, but at his wife. The golden light caught in her hair, turning the wildflowers there into tiny jewels. He saw the journey of 1,000 miles in her eyes, the hardships she had endured, the unshakable dignity that was the core of her being. He had asked for a wife, a simple cure for his loneliness. He had been given a queen, a partner, a heart that understood the language of his own silent one. She felt his gaze and turned to him, a soft, knowing smile on her lips. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the reins, her warmth seeping into him. "Home?" she asked, the single word encompassing everything, the cabin that awaited them, the life they would build, the haven they were for each other. Nash felt a great swelling peace settle in his chest, a feeling he had been searching for his entire life without knowing it. He nodded, his throat too thick for 1,000 eloquent words that all meant less than this one. "Home," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. Together, they turned their horses away from the setting sun and rode into the deepening twilight of the mountains. Two separate worlds, two solitary souls, now joined as one, their silhouettes merging against the vast, promising canvas of their future.